Hello, welcome to the Dr. Tyra Hodge Show, or some of you may be watching Parenting Connections. I'm Dr. Hodge's show. Today I have Mr. Mike Noriega. He is the author of a grief book. It's very timely for me, as I was just sharing with him that I just lost my ex-husband this week, and so I had 4 children that called him dad. And so there's a lot of grief going on, but I really want to talk about his writing. Mike, welcome to the show. Thank you for coming on with me.
Oh, thank you for having me, Tyra.
So you have been called a thought leader on grief. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, my book is kind of based around the events that happened with the Surfside condo collapse. And for those that don't know, it was a residential building that partially collapsed in the middle of the night while most of its residents were sleeping. There was 55 apartment units that came down, and it brought down 101 people with it. 98 of those people died. One of them being my grandmother, which was like my second mother. She was the matriarch of our family. And at first, kind of going through everything that my family and I went through, which was a very unique perspective because we were actually on the scene in front of the collapse site. It was very, very hard, and all we could think about was our loss. But when you look at the collective losses from everybody from within that building, there's so many stories. There's a woman that I write about that she lost her 5-year-old son and her husband just overnight. And
Your
the only
book,
reason she's
your book is called Inconsolable, Unconsolable
it's it's
Soul.
called it's called Uncollapsible Soul, and the subtitle
Uncollapsible
is How Do
Soul.
You Endure a Broken Heart Without Crushing Your Spirit?
Okay. So I wanted to get that out there, and I didn't want to forget about his book, especially if you're dealing with grief. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mike, but you were talking about after the collapse, you thought about the collective of souls that were actually lost in that collapse. I'm sorry. Could you continue where you were?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there was 97 other people that passed away, and as I got to know not just the stories, but the people behind those stories that were going through incredible amounts of grief, it really rocked my world where I started to relive the trauma of what my family and I lived through, but through so many different perspectives. And I had to go through my own healing process. And I realize now that the whole reason that I wrote this book was not because of the Surfside condo collapse that happened on June 24th, 2021. Rather, it was actually because long before that, about 10 years prior or 8 years prior to that, I had gone through the worst emotional experience I had ever gone through, which was an unforeseen divorce. And the only way that I can really word it is the day that my wife left me, my heart was broken.
Yeah.
But the day of our divorce, where I thought God was going to save our marriage, my spirit was crushed.
Wow.
And there's a huge difference between a broken heart and a crushed spirit. Scripture says in Psalm 34:18 that the Lord is near to the brokenhearted and rescues those that are crushed in spirit. But you have to stop and think, why does God want to be near to you in one? He doesn't want to take you away from a broken heart, but he wants to rescue you from a crushed spirit. And it's because those two things are different.
Hmm.
Because a broken heart is unavoidable. We all go through loss. We all go through grief. Like before we started this call, I was telling you how deeply sorry I am for your loss because you guys had 4 children together. Like you're empathizing with your children in their grief. And so none of us can escape sorrow. But a crushed spirit is where you identify with the sorrow as who you are. It's losing your faith, your hope, and your purpose. It's like a bird without wings or a well without water. And you go from living to just existing. And so I lived in that place for 2 years where I lost everything by chasing nothing. And so I learned how to endure a broken heart without it crushing your spirit once God delivered me from a crushed spirit. And that journey brought me to the condo collapse where I lost my grandmother and it broke my heart, but did not crush my spirit. And so I wanted to share not just my journey, but the practical steps that I took for healing and restoration in my soul.
Wow. So, you've been writing, obviously. What else have you been involved with?
Well, most of my career has been as a financial professional, counseling and working with just thousands of families. And that really gave me the freedom to where when I got that middle of the night phone call that you hope to never get, but we got it. When my old life was dead, I was very grateful that uh, God had put me in a position to where I had been so busy chasing calling that when that happened, it was calling was now chasing me. And I never had a desire to write a book. I don't consider myself an author, even though I have written a book and I am an author. I consider myself a communicator, but I had to force myself to write this book. And the reason why is because one of my favorite quotes is by Mark Batterson. He says that an inheritance is what you leave behind for someone, but a legacy is what you leave behind in someone. And I felt that a book would be one of the best ways for my grandmother's legacy to live on, touching lives in a very tangible, real way, even though she is no longer with us. And so that's kind of what I've spent my time doing. It's now been in ministry in collaboration with my church, with my book, with public speaking engagements, and great opportunities like this one that I'm so gracious you gave to me.
Oh, I'm the one that's given the pleasure. So tell me about one of your favorite chapters in the book and why.
You know, that's a really tough question to answer because my book is actually separated into three sections. It's phase one, phase two, and phase three.
Okay.
Phase one starts the book out as if nobody, as if the reader has never even heard of the Surfside condo collapse. So it kind of takes everything from the beginning. And then phase two not only shares the collection of stories, each chapter is actually dedicated to one person that either lived or died in the collapse, but how that person's story or journey actually had a huge impact in my healing. So with each story is an entire chapter dedicated to the healing process and what I call the to requisition, 5 requisites to restoration. See, I believe you have an education background and you were a teacher, correct?
I am an educator. I am a what you call a social emotional learning director, and I supervise the counselors in our district. So, but I have been in the classroom in the past, and a lot of experience with working with students with emotional disturbances.
I love that. I love that. So, you know, we hear prerequisite or prereq kind of as an educational term for class, things like that. But a requisite is just something that precedes something else. And so the 5 requisites to restoration are 5 steps you must follow in order for your soul to find healing and to find restoration. And they're not a theory, they're just very practical things that I did. And I really believe that when you know how to go through seasons of life where you have a broken heart without it crushing your spirit, it allows you to live your life in a way where you can have fear, but fear does not have you. You can have pain, but pain does not have you. And it makes your soul uncollapsible. I think the entire book, if you really were to summarize it, that at the end of the day, on the outside, it looks like it's about Surfside, and it is, but it's really not about Surfside. It's about the person reading. And the whole goal of Uncollapsible Soul is how to go from being in a state of life where you don't know how you're going to get through this season and you're hoping for a miracle And the end game of the book is for you to go from hoping to become a miracle to actually becoming a miracle. You
Wow.
know, I really believe that's what God does through our stories when we find healing, that we find purpose in our pain. And the beauty of finding purpose in our pain is that it's no longer about our healing. It's about other people's healing. Because the ultimate thing in life, it's not the duration of our lives, it's the donation of our lives. And so when we heal, we can get to that place where we find very deep purpose in our pain.
Wow. Mike, tell me about the process you used into actually getting these people together to talk to you about the family members that died.
Really, the way it started was after the condo collapse happened, a lot of the residents that survived that were in the building that did not collapse, they could no longer live in the building. So they were all moved to a family reunification center. And then all of the family members of uh, people in the building that had passed away or survived, they were also moved to the family reunification center, which was a hotel a few blocks down the street. My father is a local police chief in Miami. He used to work with Miami Beach for many years. And so we were not with the families at the reunification center. Rather, we were actually with all of the first responders near ground zero on Collins Avenue, where the collapse was right in front of us for 6 days until they found my grandmother. And so I never had any interaction with them at all. It wasn't till I would say 9 or 10 months after the collapse that I was added onto a WhatsApp chat. And that's really where I started to connect with the family members and get together with some of them one on one. And I wanted to go from knowing about them from the news stories I had read about and heard about to actually knowing them. And it's kind of like having a relationship with God. A lot of people know about God, but they don't know God. And it changes your life, it changes your perspective when you actually get to know God. And that's kind of what happened as I got to know these families one on one. Is it had a profound impact on my life. And there was breaking that happened as I was getting to know them, but I would also say there was breakthrough from learning about their stories.
Wow. I mean, that's actually an amazing story. That's pretty cool about how your book came together. Talking about the grief part. So, what have you learned about grief through writing the book? Because I'm sure I mean, there was a lot of research involved. And I know you talk about the three phases, but what have you learned about dealing with grief?
I've learned a lot, and what I've learned is through the what I again now call the five requisites to restoration. And I would like to actually share those with you because I
Sure.
think that's the best way to answer your question. But as I go into this, there's essentially five steps. But I believe that Jesus spoke in parables because our brains are not wired to think in words. Rather, we think in pictures. It's almost like
Um,
a cinematic experience in our minds. And so, the picture that I want to give you for emotional healing is physical healing. So, just imagine you're in the kitchen and you're making a salad and you're cutting a tomato and you just slice right through your hand.
mm,
Well, you would have to, there's a process to healing.
yeah.
You wouldn't just ignore it. And so that brings us into our first requisite, and that's called reveal it. You have to recognize your heartbreak. In other words, you have to acknowledge your pain. Now, that sounds very, very obvious, but it's not. The world teaches a lie that all things heal with time. That is not true. Maybe all things get buried with time, but if you do not take time to face your past will face you.
Wow.
There's no running away from yourself.
Mm,
And so that's the first step is if you want to heal that cut on your hand, you have to realize, my gosh, I am bleeding everywhere and I might need stitches. Like, you have to acknowledge that. You can't pretend like you didn't cut yourself. But again, most people do that emotionally. They just pretend like the wound is not there. But then the second thing is you have to relieve it. You have to respond to your grief, which is addressing your pain after you acknowledge it. So that might mean I, I need to stop the bleeding. And you put a towel on that thing. That might mean you washing it out because what you cut yourself with was dirty and you don't want that to get throughout your bloodstream.
Mhm.
That might mean, oh my gosh, I need to go to the hospital before this is life threatening. Either way, you have to take the time where you're actually responding to it because I believe in community. I believe in doing things. I believe God used his biggest form of miracles is using other people in our lives to help bring us healing. But
Right.
make no mistake about it, your first responder to your pain always has to be yourself. And
Mm.
so sometimes that means driving yourself to the hospital. Sometimes that means stopping the bleeding. Because if you don't, you will bleed on people that never cut you, emotionally speaking.
Kind of
And so
like
the
on an
third step,
airplane, they tell you to put on your mask first before you can help somebody else. You got to make sure that you're able to help.
that is absolutely accurate. That's 100%. I love that example. Yes. So then the third step is you have to release it, which means you have to relinquish your anguish. You have to surrender your pain. So let's say you got cut so bad that you need stitches, or maybe you sliced through some tendons. Well, you got to surrender to the care of medical professionals where you may not like what they're doing. You may not like that they're having to numb you or place you under surgery or stitch you up, but it is necessary for healing. The number one reason that most people bury their pain instead of facing their pain is healing hurts. It does. Healing is painful. Facing your pain is painful. But I promise you that the pain of healing is worth the hurt because the pain of infection is way worse and it has no reward. See, when you don't take care of your wound, what will inevitably happen is it will get infected, even if it's a small cut. And what started out as even a small cut that becomes an infection might lead to an amputation. And if you don't get to a point where you're amputating that infection that has completely taken over that body part, the end result is that infection will overtake your body and kill you if you don't address it. That is so true of our spirits. The key to a crushed spirit is where you allow bitterness to take over your life.
Mhm.
See, a lot of people don't realize that passion is a result of suffering. How do you know if you're passionate about something? By definition, you're willing to suffer for it. If you're not willing to suffer for it, you are not passionate about it. That's why the passion of the Christ, his passion was suffering for us. Why? Because we are his first love.
Wow.
He is passionate about us. And so what happens with passion is that it's most people don't realize it's neutral. So when you go down this road of passion, if you're not intentional about your healing, your passion will actually go down the road of anger and bitterness, and it'll manifest in your life in that way. Passionate hatred is just bitterness. You're angry, you've lost your zeal for life. But when you become passionate about restoration, oh my gosh, that passion turns into a joy for helping other people to find their healing. And so that all happens from relinquishing your anguish and surrendering your pain. And then once you go through the healing process, that brings us to our fourth step. You have to reframe it. That means you got to rename your pain. What was once called a wound that you were bleeding from becomes called a scar.
Mm.
And when you are scarred, maybe the skin doesn't look the same, but let me tell you, that skin is thicker from it being calloused. That skin can no longer get infected, and it's now a story of triumph
Mm.
of how you went from wounded to warrior, how you went from hurt to healing. And once you've gone through that fourth step, now you can Step number 5, you can renew it. You can redeem your sorrow, and that's where you draw purpose from your pain. In scripture, it promises that every teardrop is sown to be a crop of joy in the future, to bring us a harvest of joy. See, when you find purpose in your pain, what you used to call a curse in one season, you will actually call a cure in another season that you will use as a testimony of strength to share with other people. The reason I wrote the book is because each and every single person reading Uncollapsible Soul needs to know that there is somebody in this world that needs to hear your story of how you went from breaking to breakthrough, because your story is going to stand in the gap of them finding hope or losing hope. Somebody needs to hear your story of how you went from losing faith to finding faith and finding healing. And that's really my heart behind it.
Well, that's amazing. I'm inspired. That is so good. That was almost like a sermon on wheels mixed in with the motivation speech. It's good. I really needed to hear that today because and so I was talking about the death of my ex-husband. Although 4 kids call him dad, 2 of them are his biological kids. And so they're grieving. All of them are grieving. And so probably 3 more than the 4. And so, I'm going to tell them that there's purpose in your pain. I don't know how it's going to come out, if I'll be able to say it as well as you did. And so I'm hoping.
What you asked me that question, what's the biggest lesson that I've learned on grief? And before any of the more technical things that I just shared about the process of healing, I would say the biggest lesson that I learned is the power of empathy. Jesus, the shortest verse in all of scripture is Jesus wept. But the context behind that scripture is so powerful. Jesus wept right before he raised Lazarus from the dead. Why would Jesus cry and weep if he knows he's about to raise Lazarus from the dead, and he literally had just verbalized it to his friends twice before him weeping? I don't think it was because he was sad for the loss of his friend, because his friend was about to be back. I think he wept because the hearts of those that he loved were broken. See, the power of Jesus and his impact in my life is that he is not the God of sympathy that wonders what it feels like to feel what we feel. He's not like Zeus throwing lightning bolts from heaven with the white beard. He is a God that opted into every experience we will ever face, including sorrow. That scripture is so profound in my life because Jesus could have opted out of sorrow in that moment, but he chose empathy. He could have used that as a teaching moment. Ye of little faith, I just told you I'm going to raise him from the dead. Now I'm going to show you. No, his heart broke for those that he loved, whose hearts are broken. I think the biggest lesson I've learned is, especially when it comes to like church life and Christianese, the worst thing we could ever do is throw a scripture at somebody, throw a cheap cliche at somebody. I think the greatest thing we could ever do is to be with somebody in their pain and be present and be available and just show up. And that might mean sharing a meal. That might mean just listening. That might mean crying with them. But it means having a heart of empathy.
Mike, thank you so much for being on the show. And I hope to hear great things from you in the future. And whenever you have another project, please let me know. I would love to have you back on the show. I want you to be blessed in your endeavors, and take care. And thank you very much.
It was an honor to be on here. Thank you so much for having me. And I'll be praying over you and your 4 children.
Thank you. After that night, something inside me broke.
When I looked in her eyes in that moment, what I saw was a very wounded, hurting individual.
And who better to help someone than someone that you walk in their shoes?
I didn't want to live anymore. I didn't want to hurt anymore. I didn't want to struggle anymore. I'm in it. I was like, there's nothing for me to live for, just let me die.
And to not just get her teaching certificate, but to go on to get her degree, her master's, and now Dr. Tyra Hodge, for her to be an author, and everything that she's doing is just absolutely amazing. She knew what these single parents and sometimes these runaway girls what they had to go through.
Dr. Hodge is always just enthusiastic and loving and kind, and just really recognizes and commentates on your positive traits. It really makes you feel special.
My job today is to make sure that you leave with hope.